Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, brought to you by Revive Active. Steady energy that works in synergy with your body. Shop the full range at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies or health food stores nationwide.
Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by Go Loud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the Go Loud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Welcome back to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries with me, your host Nules. Before we get into this week's case, I just wanted to give a big shout out to my wonderful sponsor Revive Active. I'm so delighted to have partnered up with them, as what sets this Irish brand apart is the science behind it. Their powdered supplements are formulated using bioavailable ingredients, meaning your body actually absorbs the ingredients. For me, the biggest benefit has been the lack of an afternoon slump. It provides that steady energy throughout the day while also supporting your immune system and your heart. It's a premium product that genuinely makes a difference to how you feel. Available online at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies and health food stores across Ireland. Now, let's get into today's story. Now, before we start, I just want to let you all know that this episode will deal with the death of a young mother. It deals with pregnancy and with a fatal backstreet abortion, including some of the medical details of how Helen died. It also touches on the death of a newborn baby. So if any of that would make for difficult listening for any of you, I'm just letting you know the contents before we start the episode. Okay? On the night Helen O'Reilly died, her 6 children were asleep in convents across Dublin. Not together. They were scattered. The eldest was 9 years old. They were in the care of nuns in different institutions in different parts of the city. Their mother was 33, and she had no home of her own to bring a single one of them back to. On the morning of Wednesday, the 18th of April 1956, just after 6:30, a milkman doing his early morning rounds came up a quiet Georgian street just off St. Stephen's Green, Hume Street. A street with a row of short, respectable, fine old houses and the City of Dublin Skin and Cancer Hospital. The city wasn't properly awake yet. There was no cars, no one about. And there, partly on the pavement and partly down the basement steps at number 15, he found the body of a woman lying on the cold ground. She was Helen O'Reilly, a mother of 6 from County Kilkenny, who had crossed the sea and waited in this city to keep an appointment she knew was dangerous. And the woman who'd been convicted of killing her lived 2 doors up the same street. For 70 years, this has been somebody else's story. Today it's Helen's. I'm Nules, and welcome back to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Nearly every time this case has been told, it's been told under another name. It's filed in the archives as the Mamie Cadden case, or Mamie Cadden. The books are about her. The retrospectives lead with her photograph, her sports car, her fur coat. And the woman whose death was the whole reason any of it ever came to court, well, she's been treated more often than not as a footnote in her own killing, which, when you stop and think about it, is a strange and sad thing to do to a person. So we're going to do it the other way around today, because the woman on the pavement was not a footnote. She was a person with a life, with people around her that loved her, with 6 children. So today, the story is hers, the way it should have been all along. Helen O'Reilly was, as I said, 33 in the spring of 1956. Now, you'll see 34 in a few places. Her exact date of birth doesn't survive anywhere reliable. She came, by all accounts, from Ballyraggart in North County Kilkenny. She was a married woman, and her husband is where this story takes a turn you would not see coming, because John Francis O'Reilly was a German spy. I'm not kidding you, he was a German spy. He was born in County Clare in 1916, the son of an RIC sergeant. And not just any sergeant. His father was one of the policemen who arrested Roger Casement at Bannistrand in 1916, one of the most famous arrests in the whole history of this country. The son went a very different road. During the war, he made his way to Berlin and ended up broadcasting propaganda back to Ireland over German radio. And on a night in December 1943, he was dropped by parachute out of a Luftwaffe aircraft into a field in his own home county, sent back as an agent of Nazi Germany. He was picked up within hours, interned for the rest of the war. He made one brief escape, but he got recaptured and was let go in the summer of 1945. He married after all of that, and he and Helen went on to have 6 children. And then, in 1955, he left. He went abroad to work for a mining company out in Nigeria, and that's where he was the night Helen died, thousands of miles away, with no part whatsoever in anything that happened in Dublin. Why the marriage ended and he left for Nigeria, what really happened, I couldn't find any reliable source that would give me that information, so I'm not going to speculate. What the official record states plainly is that he deserted her. And it uses that word, deserted, not separated. And in the Ireland of 1956, believe me, those were 2 very different words with 2 very different weights hanging off them. Because a deserted wife with 6 children and no money had almost nothing. There was no real safety net under her at all. So the children were placed in care, sent to convents around the city, separated from one another. And by early 1956, Helen herself had no fixed address, none. She was moving between Ireland and England, where she had a sister over in Preston. And it was in England that she became involved with a man and became pregnant. And here's where you really see how trapped she was. Under the law at the time, a child born to a married woman was presumed to be the child of her husband. And not just presumed, it was what they call an irrefutable presumption. You were not even allowed to argue against it. It didn't matter a damn that your husband had been on another continent for the best part of a year. In the eyes of the law, the child she was carrying would be his. So this was never going to stay a private matter. It carried a permanent public mark for her and for the child. And the country she was carrying that child in had every other door bolted shut as well. There was no divorce in this state, and the constitutional ban on it wouldn't even be lifted by referendum until 1995. There was no legal contraception of any kind, not the pill, not anything, and there wouldn't be until the 1980s. And even then, only for married couples, on a prescription, if you don't mind. An abortion was a criminal offence under an old Victorian statute, the Offences Against the Person Act, 1861. To procure one or to perform one was a felony, and it could carry life imprisonment for the woman as much as for whoever helped her. And of course, all of those things still went on. They just went on behind closed doors. Women who could afford it crossed over to England, came back, and nobody was any the wiser. And women who couldn't afford it went on a name somebody had slipped them to one of a small handful of people in Dublin who do it for cash behind a closed door, no questions asked. And presiding over the whole lot of it was the church. They were consulted on the laws, the running of the schools, the running of the hospitals, the running of the very institutions where Helen's own children were sleeping that night. For a woman in Helen's position, the weight of all of that pressed down on her every single day she was alive. It's just hard to fathom now, isn't it? She didn't go straight to Hume Street. She tried to deal with it herself first, taking certain drugs in the hope of ending the pregnancy. They didn't work. By the middle of April, she was 5 months gone, running out of road, running out of time. And so she did what a certain number of desperate women in her position were doing in that decade, out of sight, where nobody would talk about it. She went looking for someone who'd do it for her. The woman she'd ended up in front of was Mary Ann Cadden, Mamie Cadden, Nurse Cadden to have Dublin. In April of 1956, she was 64, soon to turn 65. She'd been born in Pennsylvania in 1891 to Irish parents and brought back to County Mayo as a small child of about 4. She trained in Dublin as a midwife at the National Maternity Hospital in Holles Street and qualified at the end of 1926. And what she went on to do with that qualification is honestly one of the strangest criminal careers this country has ever produced. It started respectable enough. She worked in a nursing home, then opened her own. First a place in Ranelagh, then a bigger, fancier one on Lower Rathmines Road. By day, this was legitimate midwifery. She delivered babies. She took in expectant mothers. But running alongside the legitimate business, in the background was a second one, arranging the fostering and adoption of babies. Some of it above board for the time, and some of it very much not. And for cash, and by word of mouth, performing illegal abortions. In 1939, it caught up with her for the first time. A newborn baby was found abandoned out near Dunshaughlin in County Meath, and the trail led back to Cadden. Her car, which I should say was not a car that blended into the background, had been noticed in the area, and a birth at her institution was found to have gone unregistered. She was convicted of child abandonment, given a year's hard labour in Mountjoy, and struck off the register of midwives. Her business was finished. The respectable half of the operation was gone. So what did she do? She served her year and went straight back to it. Set herself up again in a basement on Upper Pembroke Street and advertised openly in the medical column of a Dublin evening paper. Nurse Cadden, male and female ailments treated, massage and so on. Now, female ailments, everyone of that period knew exactly what that meant. It was code, and the people who needed to read it could read it. And in the mid-1940s, it caught up with her for a second time. A young domestic servant, only around 20 years of age, ended up in hospital with acute peritonitis after a procedure, and this time Cadden was convicted of attempting to procure a miscarriage. And the judge who sentenced her said she was easily one of the worst people who'd stood in front of him in 18 years on the bench. 5 years penal servitude she got, served in Mountjoy. She came out around 1950, nearly 60 years of age, 2 convictions and a struck-off name behind her. And she took a single room at number 17 Hume Street, just off St. Stephen's Green. And from that one room, she went straight back, a third time, to the exact same work. By the 1950s, she had something close to a monopoly on it in Dublin, partly because the state had prosecuted and driven out a number of others. So, by 1956, she was, you could say, infamous. The medical profession knew about her. The senior Gardaí knew about her very well indeed. Sure, she'd been through their hands twice, you could say. And among ordinary Dubliners, and women in particular, everyone seemed to know her name. But you'd only ever hear it from someone who'd been to her, or knew someone who had. There was no plate on the door, no number to ring. You were sent to her by somebody who'd been, or who knew somebody who'd been. She drove a bright red open-top sports car that nobody could miss. She dined and drank in Dublin's best hotels. She went to dances. She did not hide away from anybody. Now, there's a kind of romance that sometimes gets draped over a figure like this. The backstreet abortionist as a bit of a folk heroine, an angel of deliverance, doing the necessary. A legal mercy for women the state had thrown away. And I have to be honest with you, that version does not fit Mamie Cadden. And the historians who've gone deepest into her are blunt about that. She was, by their account, cruel, judgmental, and entirely without sympathy for the frightened women who came up her stairs. In her own surviving letters, she wrote about former clients with open contempt and scorn. This was not mercy. It was a trade run by a woman who held the women who needed her in something close to disgust and charged them for the privilege. And she was dangerous at the work itself, because Helen O'Reilly was not the first woman whose death touched Hume Street. Back in 1951, a young woman named Bridget Breslin, a dancer at the Olympia Theatre, around 33 herself, died of an air embolism after a procedure meant to end a pregnancy. And suspicion fell on Cadden almost straight away. But there was no evidence tying Breslin to her rooms, nothing that linked the body to the flat, And in the end, no charge was ever brought. There was no trial, no reckoning. Bridget Breslin just slipped out of the record altogether. In that time period, no charge had ever been brought against anyone. So when Helen climbed those stairs, she was not walking in to a careful professional who happened one terrible time to make a single fatal mistake. She was walking up to a woman in her mid-60s with a 20-year record of incompetence, of abandonment, and of at least one earlier death hanging over her. And Helen had no way in the world of knowing any of that. She knew only that there was a woman in Dublin who would do it for money. Whoever passed her that name had pointed her at the worst possible door in that whole city. On the evening of Tuesday, the 17th of April, 1956, Helen went to 17 Hume Street. Now, what happened inside that room cannot be fully reconstructed, and I'm not even going to try to pretend to you that it can. As far as the record can prove, the only people at the heart of what happened were Helen and Cadden. Helen could never afterwards say what was done to her, and Cadden never gave any account of it, then or later. What we have is what the state pathologist read from the body, what the Gardaí took out of that room, and what came out piece by piece at the trial. The method in cases like this was crude and it was specific. A solution of water and disinfectant were pumped into the womb by syringe. The idea being to separate the sac from the wall of the uterus and force a miscarriage. That was the procedure. And in Helen's case, something went badly wrong with it. Air entered her bloodstream. It travelled to her heart and it stopped it, an air embolism. With an injury of that kind, collapse and death don't take long. They come within minutes. So there would have been very little time between whatever was being done to her and Helen being gone. And so Helen O'Reilly died in a cramped one-room flat at 17 Hume Street on the night of the 17th of April 1956 at 33 years old. And no one who was beside her in that room would ever say a single word about how she spent the last minutes of her life. And that's an awful thing when you think about it. And then there was the problem of her body. Sometime in the hours before dawn, Helen was moved out of that flat and out onto the street and left at number 15, 2 doors down from number 17, lying partially on the pavement and partially down the steps to the basement. And on the ground, a drag mark, some 3 feet long, ran from where she lay back along the path through to number 17. The body had not been carried with any care at all. It had been dragged. And a question has hung over this part of it ever since. Cadden was in her mid-60s. She was not a large woman or a strong woman. And between that room and the street, there were stairs. So could a woman of her age have moved Helen out of that flat, down the stairs and along the pavement on her own? It was a question at the time, and it's been a question in every single retelling since. But the record anchors it firmly. The official file never established that anyone helped her. No second person was ever shown to have taken part. No accomplice was ever proven. And nobody else was ever charged in connection with moving Helen's body. As far as the record stands, whatever was done that night was not shown to be the work of anyone but Cadden. And the question, however natural it is to ask it, stays just that, a question. Just after 6:30 on the morning of the 18th, the milkman came up the empty street on the Lucan Dairies round. His name was Patrick Rigney. At first, in the half light of the morning, what he saw on the path near number 15 might have looked like a bundle of clothes. But it wasn't. It was a woman lying still, no movement at all, and Rigney went and got the Gardaí. Within a couple of hours, Hume Street was sealed off and the state pathologist had been called to the scene to examine where the body lay. And the post-mortem told the real story, and it was not the story the scene first suggested. Helen was 5 months pregnant. She had not been the victim of any random street attack. She had died of an air embolism indoors during an attempted abortion, and her body had then been brought out and left where it was found. The whole shape of it, the embolism and the pregnancy, pointed away from the open street and back towards the room. and the drag mark on the pavement narrowed that room down to a very short list of doors, all of them on that one street. And identifying her didn't take long either. Helen's name was found written in a receipt book that was in Cadden's own possession, and it was confirmed from a bank book among her belongings. So there it was, in Cadden's own records, a name in writing, and the name of the woman who lived at the door the drag mark pointed back towards was already known to every senior detective in the city. So they went up to number 17, and Cadden, by every account, was perfectly composed when they came in, not a bother on her. Sure, she'd been doing this for the better part of 30 years. She'd been arrested twice already in her career. She knew exactly how this morning was going to go. She let them search. She gave her first statement to the Gardaí that same day, and it was a flat, cool denial. The first she'd heard of any dead woman, she said, was when the guards knocked on her own front door. Then they searched the room, and what came out of it was, by any standard of the time, overwhelming. Higginson syringes, the rubber bulb kind, 2 duck-billed specula, the instruments used to open the birth canal, a flushing curette, a surgical clamp, a red dressing. In all, some 45 separate items were eventually laid out as exhibits, and the state pathologist would tell the courts that every single one of them had a use in carrying out an abortion. This was not a room you could explain away as a midwife's leftovers. And then there was a diary, and Cadden, careful to the last, had not written her clients' names in it. She recorded them by description instead. A Garda technical officer worked on that diary using photographic light filters, bringing up entries that had been deliberately obscured. And the entry for the 17th of April, the night Helen came, read simply, black coat. 2 words. That was how Helen O'Reilly was filed by the woman she'd gone to, not by her name, by the coat she was wearing. And I think that one detail tells you everything you need to know about how Cadden saw that poor frightened woman who came to her for help. And then there was the forensic side of it. Now, there was no DNA in 1956, no databases, none of the tools we'd take for granted today. What a scientist could do back then was take hairs and fibres, compare them under a microscope, look for matches in colour and structure, and give an opinion in court. And that's what was done here. Hairs and fibres taken from Cadden's room were compared against samples from Helen's body and her clothing, and they were said to match. And the prosecution used that to support the case that Helen had been in Cadden's room. That the dead woman left out on the pavement and the living woman up in the flat had been in the one room together. And here's a detail about the decision to prosecute that tells you how this case looked even to the people building it. The chief state solicitor's first view was that there wasn't enough here to bring a charge of murder at all. That without something tying Cadden's own hand directly to Helen's death, a murder case would not stand. And it was the Attorney General who took the other view and overruled him, and directed that Mamie Cadden be prosecuted for murder. So even before it ever reached a courtroom, the gravest possible charge in this case was a contested call within the state itself. Think about that now, because that'll matter later. Mamie Cadden was charged with murder. The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court in October of 1956 and ran for about 10 days, before a judge and a jury of 12 men. Now, women weren't absolutely banned from juries in this state, but in practice they were almost entirely absent from them. Under the jury law of the time, a woman was automatically exempt unless she actively applied to put herself on the jurors list, and almost nobody ever did. So when Helen O'Reilly's death came before a court in 1956, it was judged, like nearly every serious criminal case then, by 12 men. The woman on the pavement and the woman in the dock would both have their fates decided by men, and more than 80 witnesses had given statements to the Gardaí over the course of the investigation. Now, the legal basis of this case matters enormously, because without it, the verdict just does not make sense. Cadden was charged with murder, but nobody, not even the prosecution, was claiming she'd set out to kill Helen O'Reilly. It was accepted on all sides that the death was the result of a procedure that had gone wrong, not a deliberate killing. So how in God's name do you get to murder from that? Well, the answer comes down to a doctrine in that 1861 Act. Constructive malice, it was called. And the way it worked was this. If a person died during the commission of a felony, then whoever was committing that felony was guilty of murder, whether or not they'd ever intended anyone to die. The unlawful act itself, in law, supplied the malice. And performing an illegal abortion was a felony. So the chain was complete. Illegal abortion, a death during it, therefore murder. No intention to kill required at all. And the judge put this to the jury about as bluntly as it can be put. It did not matter, he told them, that the accused hadn't desired the death or hadn't wished it or had even tried to prevent it. And it did not matter that Helen had consented to what was done to her. None of that was a defence. If they were satisfied the felony had been committed and that Helen had died as a result, the law called it murder. So manslaughter was not really on the table. Death by misadventure was not on the table. In this courtroom, it was murder, or it was an acquittal, and nothing in between. And the prosecution had a great deal to lay in front of those 12 men. The instruments from the room, the surgical clamp, the disinfectant method matching the cause of death, the hair and the fibre matches putting Helen in the flat, the state pathologist evidence of air embolism, the drag mark running from the body back towards number 17. And sitting behind all of that, in the knowledge of every senior Garda in the case, those 2 earlier convictions. Cadden pleaded not guilty. She denied she performed any procedure on Helen O'Reilly or on anyone else. And her defence team did what any competent defence would do with a case like this. They went at all the seams. They challenged the chain of evidence linking Helen to the flat. They questioned how reliable a hair and fibre comparison really was, given the science of the day. And they pressed correctly enough on the fact that it was a circumstantial case. No one had witnessed what happened inside that room, and there was no confession from their client. But there were 2 arguments the defence wanted to make, and in the end, simply could not support. They wanted a medical expert to go after the cause of death evidence and offer the jury another explanation. And they wanted someone to stand up and testify that a woman of Cadden's age and build could not physically have moved a body out of that room and down to the street on her own. And they could not produce the witnesses to do either. And you have to understand why. In the Ireland of 1956, finding a doctor willing to walk into a courtroom and testify on behalf of Mamie Cadden, the notorious abortionist, was not a small thing to ask of any man. The professional and the religious pressures of that time bore down on her defence every bit as hard as they had on Helen herself. And then there's a part of this trial that has not aged well at all, and it needs to be said plainly, because it's right there in the official record, in the court's own words. When the judge came to sum the case up for the jury, he spent time on Helen's character. He described Helen as a woman living apart from her husband, living with other men, associating with men over in Preston and men here in this country, visiting public houses and spending long periods of time in them. And the Garda papers, in their own turn, had described her as a woman of loose morals. So Helen, who could not speak, who could not answer, who was the victim in this case, was put on a kind of a second trial of her own character. And the institutions did it in language they plainly felt no need to soften. It's a disgrace, really. So I just felt it was worth calling it out. And it all played out alongside a strange old spectacle in the courtroom itself. And Cadden herself sat through the whole thing in a fur coat, composed, giving nothing away, watched on some of those days by a little group of well-dressed young women who'd come to the court to support her. And in the end, the jury was out for less than an hour. On the 1st of November 1956, they came back and found Mamie Cadden guilty of the murder of Helen O'Reilly. And she took the verdict in the same composed silence she'd kept through the whole trial. She had no reaction. Asked whether she had anything to say, she had nothing to say. And the judge passed the only sentence the verdict allowed him to pass: death by hanging. And that made her the last woman in this state ever to be sentenced to death for a crime of this kind. And the unease set in almost at once. And it was not mostly unease about whether she'd done it. The evidence on that point was strong. And even the writers who've been more sympathetic, I suppose you could say, to Cadden accept that she had caused Helen's death. No, the unease was about the idea of hanging her for it. Because here she was, an old woman who had not meant to kill, according to records. The death had come from an injection during a botched procedure under a doctrine that turned a death nobody intended into murder, just by the way the law worked. And there was a real and growing sense in legal and political circles that constructive malice was being stretched here to carry far more weight than it ought to. That if this was a crime, then honestly it was a lot closer to manslaughter than it was to murder. And running underneath the legal arguments was a plainer, more human feeling, a deep reluctance to put a woman in her 60s on the end of a rope, 30 years after the state had last hanged a woman. And there was a pattern behind that reluctance. Between independence and the abolition of the death penalty, 22 women in Ireland were sentenced to death, and only one of them was ever actually executed. Anne Walsh. She was hanged back in 1925. The other 21 were all reprieved. So a death sentence on a woman by the 1950s had become a sentence the state pronounced and then, almost as a matter of course, stepped back from. The sentence the judge passed on Cadden was mandatory. Once the jury said murder, he had no option in front of him. So the real question was never really whether she'd hang. It was whether the state would break, in her case, with what had become its own settled habit of mercy. And behind closed doors, the state's own view of her was not simply that she deserved to die. A Department of Justice memorandum weighing up what to do put both halves of it in the one breath. That the woman was undoubtedly a really bad lot, but that the killing of Mrs. O'Reilly, while it had happened in the course of an illegal act, was definitively not premeditated. And there it is, the whole tension of the thing in one official sentence. Contempt for Cadden on the one side, and on the other, the plain admission that she had not set out to kill anybody. Her appeal went to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and at the end of December 1956, it was dismissed. The court also refused to certify the case for the Supreme Court, which closed off the road to a higher hearing. So the legal avenues were, in effect, finished. What was left was mercy. And the letters came. One of the most striking was from Owen Sheehy Skeffington, who wrote to the Taoiseach, John A. Costello, on New Year's Day of 1957. And his argument was not really about Cadden's innocence at all, it was about the country itself. Society, he wrote, would lose a measure of its own self-esteem, would degrade itself, if it went ahead and hanged this wretched creature. The Irish Association of Civil Liberty wrote in the same direction, pressing for a reprieve. And you'll notice, it's hard not to, that even the people writing to save her life couldn't quite bring themselves to speak about her with much dignity. This wretched creature, that was the advocacy. On the 4th of January 1957, the Costello government recommended commutation, and the death sentence was lifted. It became penal servitude for life. So Mamie Cadden was not going to hang. She was sent instead to Mountjoy to serve out her time. And she lasted there less than 2 years. Her mental state deteriorated, and in 1958 she was declared insane and transferred to the criminal asylum at Dundrum. Now, there's a sharp reading of that move, and it comes from historians who've studied her most closely. That she was not, in fact, mad at all. That she was simply so defiant, so unrepentant, so completely willing to apologise for any of what she'd done, that it was easier for the state to shut her away as a mad woman than to face the harder questions her whole business raised about the country that had created the demand for it in the first place. Whatever the truth of that, Dundrum is where she ended up. On the 20th of April 1959, almost exactly 3 years to the day after Helen died in that flat, Mamie Cadden died at Dundrum of a heart attack. She was buried in a mass grave for the asylum inmates. And when her affairs were settled, her whole estate came to about £250. So that's roughly around €8,000 in today's money. The Cadden case has been told and retold ever since. There's a full-length biography. There are academic papers, newspaper retrospectives right up to the present day, legal essays picking over that Victorian statute and whether the conviction would even survive a modern court. And in nearly every one of them, the figure at the centre of it is Mamie Cadden. The red sports car, the fur coat, the defiance, the strange end in Dundrum. And she is, it has to be said, a compelling figure to write about. That's part of how all of this happened. And Helen drifts in and out of her own story, depending on who's doing the telling. In some accounts, she's reduced to a young woman who fell into the wrong hands. In others, she has no name at all, just an initial, Mrs. O. And she was none of those things. She was a 33-year-old married woman, deserted by a husband who was on another continent, with 6 children she had no way to keep, who had already tried and failed to end a pregnancy on her own, and who then travelled back across the Irish Sea and waited in a city not really known to her to keep an appointment she understood might kill her. And none of that, not one part of it, makes her death any less of a death, or her killing any less of a killing. And she was not the only one. She was an extreme case. But the truth of it is, she was not a rare kind of case at all. There were women all over this country in those years caught in some version of the very same trap. No divorce, no contraception, no legal way out, and no one in any official position whose job it was to ask whether any of that was acceptable. And most of their names we'll simply never know. They died at home, from drugs that failed or from procedures that went wrong, at the hands of people who never once saw the inside of a courtroom. They died in bedrooms and kitchens and back rooms, and the record just closed over them. We know about Helen at all only because where her body was left, and because of who lived just 2 doors up. The others have just vanished. Now, before I leave Helen's story, I want you to think about what it took for Helen to climb those stairs. She knew the risks. She was not a young girl who didn't understand what she was doing. She was a grown woman, a mother, and she went up to that flat anyway, to a stranger, for cash, because every other door in the country had already been shut in her face. This is not a reckless woman. This is a woman who had run clean out of options. And the fear she must have carried up those stairs into that one room, with no one in the world coming to stand between her and what was about to happen. I can barely let myself imagine it. She must have been terrified. She had to have been. And she went all the same because there was nothing else left for her to do. That is the part of this story that really, I suppose, got to me. Not what Cadden did to her, what the country did to her long before she ever reached Hume Street. We don't know what became of her 6 children. We don't know their names, and we shouldn't. Wherever they are and whoever they grew up to be, I hope they ended up having a good life. But they were her 6 children. They were real. And on that night, their mother died. They were all lying in different institutions. And the children of a mother who had been left without a single way to keep them or to keep herself. When you hear the things that were said about Helen O'Reilly afterwards, think of those 6 children in your head. That is who she was. She was failed by every system that should have stood between her and that room. And then, after she was dead, she was failed all over again by the way her death was talked about, by a court that read over her supposed sins, by official papers that called her a woman of loose morals. She was a person, she was a mother, and that was the language they should have reached for. So the least that can be done after all these years is to take the story back, take all that out of it, and give Helen back her story, to make her the name and not the footnote. This case has rarely been told, as I said, from her side. Well, now it has. Helen O'Reilly, rest in peace. So that's it for today's episode. I'll see you all next week. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves. Right, guys, that's it for another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you again to our new sponsor, Revive Active. Investigating these mysteries takes a lot of mental energy, and I've really noticed how that one morning sachet helps me stay balanced throughout the day. It's not a quick fix or a caffeine spike. It's just about sustainable, steady energy that fits into a busy life. If you want to start your own daily ritual, head over to reviveactive.com or pop into any good health food store or pharmacy nationwide. It's a simple way to look after yourself now and as you age. Until next time, I'm Nules. Take care.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active. Scientifically formulated and manufactured in Ireland. Available at all good health food stores and pharmacies or at reviveactive.com.